People who were stationed in Okinawa sometime before the internet became commonplace do this thing where they waggle their eyebrows at you when you say that you lived there. The island had a bacchanalian reputation. It was known for its promise of misanthropic adventures, where the power of the dollar could bring whatever experience you wished to fund within your grasp. That reputation has largely shifted along predictable and very disappointing lines toward Southeast Asia, specifically to Thailand. While waiting at a military airport for a military flight in Okinawa, I once overheard one young service member describing in detail the ping-pong shows he'd attended while in Thailand. He was talking them up for his buddies who might also consider going. It's clear that the appetite for easy sex and alcohol-fueled parties, the appetite that garnered Okinawa's 1990s reputation, it didn't go anywhere. So a rotund defense contractor that understood how to meet that appetite knew that he could leverage it and make millions. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. Ship support contractor Glenn Defense Marine Asia provided decades of logistical support services to the United States Navy when naval ships visited their ports in Hong Kong, Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, and other parts of the Pacific. Leonard Glenn Francis served as chief executive, president, and chairman of GDMA. Leonard grew up surrounded by the ship service industry. His grandfather started the family company in the wake of World War II. Leonard's father and uncle took turns at the helm, raising Leonard to take over. While he bided his time before taking over the family business, he also opened a pub. His taste in friends and patrons was apparently not great, and his pub was frequented by what the court called undesirable characters. He fell into the trap of thinking he needed guns to protect himself and was arrested in 1986 after Malaysian police discovered 2 Smith & Wesson revolvers and a bulletproof vest in his bedroom. In accordance with strict local gun laws, he received 6 lashes with a cane and 18 months of prison time. Following his release from prison, he left the bar and began working with his father. Within just a few years, he took over Glen Marine and the ship services they provided. His role required him to build a network, to be the face of ship services in the Pacific region. It will surprise exactly no one to learn that aircraft carriers don't have the same maneuverability as a car, and that they can't really pull up to a dock and parallel park with the might of nuclear-powered engines propelling them forward. To be fair, they can't do it with conventionally powered engines either. The heft of the ships in the naval fleet make tugboats critical, and logistical support services also work to handle local port authorities and custom fees, the provision of food and fuel, the removal of trash and waste. Providing these port and provision services is referred to as maritime husbanding. And I guess if there's a local contractor providing husbanding services, ferrying sailors ashore and around the city, keeping them safe and secure, and providing little snicky snackies, that makes the United States Navy the ultimate passenger princess. What isn't clear is what that makes the Marines aboard those U.S. Navy ships, but please feel free to let me know. The Navy maintains port-specific contracts, so sailors stay fed, clean, and mostly where they're supposed to be. The port calls also serve as a soft show of power, a raising of the American flag showing where the might of the United States Navy could easily appear. The requirement of operational security means that the Navy, unlike Carnival Cruise Line, doesn't advertise their stops as they traverse the 7 seas. I'm not sure how many days out a ship or ships call ahead and let a port know that they're on their way. As naval ships came and went in his various ports, Leonard worked to build a community of like-minded men and women. The number details of his bids were important, but it was just as important to maintain relationships with key players. Leonard was no stranger to wining and dining naval officers. But there was a darker network that began to emerge by 2006. A shadowy cohort that Leonard could rely on for favors. A group calling themselves, quote, the cool kids, but also the wolf pack. And I'm going to take this opportunity to remind everyone that if you have to call yourself cool, the title might qualify as stolen valor. Leonard went beyond wining and dining, and he bribed this shadow network of naval officers with cash, luxury items, commercial sex, travel, and parties. The luxury goods included Cuban cigars, Spanish suckling pigs, Kobe beef, top-shelf alcohol, designer handbags, leather goods, designer furniture, watches, fountain pens, ornamental swords, and handmade ship models. During one multi-day sex party at a 5-star Manila penthouse, the officers in attendance drank an alcohol bill of an estimated $50,000. I have it on good authority that for that price, you can get both expensive champagne and an entire Harley-Davidson at a pool club in Las Vegas, or approximately 50 used cars in Okinawa. It wasn't just that Leonard was providing these gifts and experiences to naval officers. It's that Leonard also had pictures and video of the Navy's best and brightest participating in these hedonistic parties. It seems a little unfair to call what Leonard gave them gifts, because the naval officers were expected to return favors. So in return for these so-called gifts, Navy officials shared classified materials, including the movements of U.S. ships and submarines, confidential contracting information, and details about ongoing investigations into GDMA. It wasn't really enough for Leonard to have marine husbanding contracts with the Navy. He could only make money if the ships actually docked at a port that he controlled. So in addition to receiving information about the movement of naval assets across and throughout the Pacific, Leonard coerced his network to redirect those naval assets to ports where GDMA could earn the most money. While those assets were in ports that he controlled, he raked in the money from provisioning fuel, food, and water, from removing waste, from tugboating the ships, and for providing valet services around town. On some occasions, he unnecessarily or fraudulently charged the Navy to send divers down to search the harbors for explosives. At the end of a port call, his shadow network was responsible for writing Bravo Zulu memos. Memos commending Leonard for providing outstanding services for the Navy. When your husbanding provider ferries you ashore and whisks you off to the bar, please remember to rate them 5 stars. The cool kids Wolfpack, I don't entirely know what to call them, clearly had some high opinions of themselves, but they weren't as clandestine as they thought they were. The same year that their loose association began, they began to raise eyebrows. One naval officer, David Schaus, noticed something odd. In his role in the Navy's Ship Support Office in Hong Kong, he received and reviewed a bill from GDMA and caught a discrepancy. GDMA had charged the Navy for supplying more water than this particular ship could actually hold. Leonard was enraged when Schaus confronted him with the discrepancy. I don't think I would do well with a 6'3", 350-pound man angry and screaming in my face, so I commend Schaus on standing his ground. Schaus attempted to document the overcharges, installing flow meters to measure just how much liquid GDMA was pumping on and off of ships. In response to these attempts, Schaus reports that his superiors told him to back off, telling him that it wasn't his job to investigate GDMA and it wasn't his job to investigate Fat Leonard, the moniker that naval officers had given him behind his back. Eventually, Schaus left the Navy and the Hong Kong Ship Support Office closed. Even though whistleblower protections are designed to protect those exposing corruption, they're not always effective. And Schaus claimed he was the victim of retaliation for trying to document and report the fraud. It is my sincere hope that we commend those that come forward and expose corruption or abuse, in recognition of the difficulty of the act itself. A whistleblower is inherently vulnerable after speaking truth to power, and it should concern us that Leonard's shadow network was so effective at dismissing Schaus's concerns. The following year, in 2007, the Navy's Inspector General forwarded a report to NCIS. The report warned that GDMA was grossly overcharging the Navy for its port security services. But nothing came of the report. Some sources claimed that everyone knew about investigations into Leonard and GDMA, but that everyone also knew that nothing would happen with those investigations. The Manila NCIS office received an anonymous letter and supporting documents alleging GDMA had overcharged the Navy for fees, armed guards providing port security, and other services provided while the Fred Stockham visited the Subic Bay port in the Philippines. That anonymous letter asked NCIS to take action to tamp down on the fraud, waste, and abuse. NCIS agents in the Manila office forwarded that letter and supporting documents to the Navy's Singapore contracting office, encouraging them to dig into the contracts they were endorsing. Unfortunately, Leonard's cool kids were in control enough to dismiss the allegations as false, painting those who disagreed with them as troublemakers needlessly harassing their contractors. It's alleged that NCIS opened and closed 27 investigations into GDMA without taking further action. But I think it's also worth noting that the Navy's Economic Crimes Unit didn't so much have cracks for cases like this to fall into, but giant gaping chasms. In the wake of the October 2000 attack on the USS Cole and the 9/11 terror attacks, the Economic Crimes Unit lost 131 staff members, most of them reassigned to focus on terrorism. That left them with a staff of just 9 people. And that was a really inauspicious time to take so many off of the Economic Crimes Unit, because following 9/11, the cash flow to private defense contractors grew by 15% each year. By 2008, private defense contractors were receiving $452 billion annually. That outpouring of money slowed in many regions during the Obama presidency, but not in the Pacific. Containing the threat of China was a fully funded focus. In 2010, Navy officials started to pick up on the growing and audacious fraud, suspecting some of the bills GDMA submitted for port services in Thailand were padded, a little bit fluffier than they should be. So the Navy brought together a team to scrutinize the contracts, but one of the cool kids fed all the information back to Leonard. Even with suspicions growing, GDMA billed the United States Navy for $200 million in services in 2011 alone. It's not clear how that number breaks down between fraudulent and legitimate billing, nor is it clear how much of that billing is the result of redirecting naval assets in the region. Years after the first sailors started ringing alarm bells about Leonard and GDMA, officials started leveraging Leonard's network and their proclivity for relaying information by falsely reporting to those beyond a trusted circle that inquiries into GDMA were closed. Leonard felt secure that no one knew of his fraud and traveled to San Diego in September 2013 to take meetings and drum up more business. No one can resist the allure of America's finest city, and this proved true for Leonard. By attending a meeting on the Asia pivot, he helped NCIS avoid a complicated plot to lure him aboard a U.S. warship in order to arrest him, or from having to deal with extradition from Singapore. After attending the meeting and learning where his particular services might prove useful, Leonard retired to his room at the Marriott for the evening. Later in the evening, visitors came pouring in. But instead of very on-brand attendees for an orgy, it was NCIS coming to raid his room and arrest him. Rolling Stone magazine's coverage of the Fat Leonard scandal includes what may be one of my favorite descriptions of the investigation that followed, because it feels like it's a summary of the next season of Traitors. It reads, "In December of 2015, the Navy summoned 200 admirals to a meeting in Washington and revealed that 30 of them were under criminal investigation. They don't clarify whether the Navy told the 30 that they were under investigation or if they just let the 200 worry and try to work out who it was. In total, about 60 current and former admirals were under investigation for their possible roles in the scandal, alongside approximately 450 other active duty and retired personnel. Federal prosecutors filed criminal charges against dozens of people in connection to Leonard, and many of them have since pled guilty. Among those who have pled guilty are 4 of Leonard's top aides and 17 separate Navy officials ranging from commissioned officers to petty officers, as well as 1 former NCIS special agent and 2 civilian contracting officials. 5 other naval officers faced courts-martial under the UCMJ. Separately, a civilian contracting officer in Singapore was convicted for her role and sentenced to 6 years in local custody. Leonard himself pled guilty in January 2015, naming 7 Navy officials who accepted bribes. In pleading guilty, he acknowledged paying off officials with approximately $500,000 in cash and millions of dollars worth of luxury goods. Leonard remained in confinement until December 18, 2017, when the court granted his request for release pending sentencing so that he could receive medical treatment. While he received treatment for renal cancer, Leonard was too unwell to return to the custody of the U.S. Marshals. Instead, Leonard stayed at a rented private residence, which some sources indicate was owned by his doctor. There he was under round-the-clock supervision, a cost incurred by his family. I don't entirely know what to make about Leonard staying at what's been reported was his doctor's house, but that's weird, right? When I made my appointment for an annual physical, the first available was 4 months out. That got canceled when my doctor called out sick. I rebooked for 6 months out. That makes it an appointment 10 months after I started trying to make it. And this man was just living in his doctor's home? It seems weird that a doctor should make money off of their patient by providing them a rental home, but also equally weird if the doctor is charging under market value for the rental to a man already then convicted of stealing tens of millions of dollars from the United States Navy. In 2020, having apparently beaten renal cancer and dropped a significant amount of weight, Leonard received a clean bill of health. At that point, COVID was raging, Leonard was 2 years into his house arrest, and he continued to cooperate in the criminal case against his corrupted cohort while he awaited sentencing. So it seems like no one was in a hurry to move him to a more secure living arrangement. The treatment Leonard received in San Diego was revitalizing. With his newly trimmed form, he was more energetic. And sometime between 7:30 a.m. and 8 a.m. on September 4th, 2020, he slipped his digital leash and disappeared before anyone could respond to the alert. It wasn't just the excellent healthcare options in San Diego that made it such an ideal place for Leonard to convalesce while awaiting his sentencing. San Diego is just a stone's throw away from the international border with Mexico, so Leonard made it to Mexico where he chartered a flight to Cuba. Next, he made his way to Caracas, Venezuela. While Leonard was on the lam, the U.S. Marshals circulated his mugshot, offering a $40,000 reward for information that might lead to his capture. 17 days after cutting off his ankle monitor, he was apprehended at the Simón Bolívar International Airport, preparing to board a flight to Russia. Russia, a prime example of an oligarchical nation, would be a soft landing space for a wealthy felon on the lam from bilking the United States for unearned or unfairly earned dollars. Notably, Venezuela has an extradition treaty with the United States and Russia does not. In what might be perceived as an interesting turn of the tables, Leonard requested asylum while he was in Venezuela. It took months to negotiate an extradition agreement to return Leonard to the United States, but about 14 months after he slipped away, Venezuela returned him. In exchange for Leonard's return, the United States freed Alex Saab, an associate of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, accused of money laundering. If you're looking for additional background information to better anchor you on Venezuela's current woes, I do touch on some of them in episode 45, The United States versus Cook. 4 months ago, in November 2024, Fat Leonard was sentenced to 15 years in prison for bribery, fraud, and his failure to appear in court. That broke down to 13.5 years for bribery and fraud and 16 months for failing to appear. In conjunction with his prison sentence, he was ordered to pay $20 million in restitution, to forfeit $35 million in ill-gotten gains, and to pay a $150,000 fine. Following a federal conviction, a defendant has 14 days from the entry of judgment to file a notice of appeal, and Leonard, predictably, has done just that. His appeal will be heard by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal. I think the same realities that make operational security so necessary also make it easier to perpetrate fraud against the defense industry. If you don't tell anyone that the ship is headed to Port A because you can't tell anybody that the ship is headed to Port A, it might not ring alarm bells to redirect them to Port B for a kickback from GDMA. For the sake of stability and forward planning, contracts are lengthy to avoid constant bidding cycles and uncertainty, which might make it difficult to discern what the fair market value of the services provided actually is. And separately, in a system as hierarchical as the military, outing your superiors for being on the take can be a dangerous dance on the line between whistleblowing and mutiny. In spaces where a necessary lack of transparency makes it difficult to bring corruption to light, inspectors general are necessary and important safeguards. I didn't select this case in reaction to the termination of up to 17 inspectors general, but here we are. Inspectors general are responsible for rooting out government waste, fraud, abuse, and misconduct. They are watchdogs embedded within federal agencies and departments who are not beholden to the relevant secretary or agent head. Congress created these positions in 1978, partially in response to the Watergate scandal. The first inspectors general were appointed during Jimmy Carter's term, and Ronald Reagan bristled at what he apparently perceived to be a partisan position. He fired all of the inspectors general appointed by Jimmy Carter, although he later hired some of them back. Following that initial hiccup, the positions have been recognized as nonpartisan, and inspectors general have remained in place when new presidents are sworn in. In 2020, Donald Trump sidelined a number of inspectors general, believing they were unfairly performing their congressionally mandated duties. 2 weeks ago, his deputy chief of staff emailed between 12 and 17 inspectors general, firing them. As of the date of this recording, the White House has not released a list of the terminated inspectors general, but the reported list so far includes the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Education, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of the Interior, the Department of Labor, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Small Business Administration. As relevant to this episode, the Department of Defense Inspector General has reportedly also been fired. Together, these federal agencies control trillions of taxpayer dollars and a significant portion of the federal budget. While the email terminations didn't comply with the required 30 days notice to Congress and faces challenges on those grounds, if the intent is to fire the inspectors general, there aren't significant barriers to accomplishing just that. Injecting partisanship into this particular government safeguard serves primarily to ensure that the fox is guarding the henhouse, and to make it even more difficult for whistleblowers to come forward. The Navy's Inspector General was particularly important in this case, the Fat Leonard case, given that so many investigators had been transferred out of working on economic crimes. Had the Inspector General's report of suspected waste been heeded in 2007, American taxpayers could have been spared 6 years of overpayment and corruption to the tune of an estimated $35 million. The web that Leonard maintained was extensive, and the investigation kneecapped the Navy for years. In order to separate the wheat from the chaff, the Navy had to investigate and clear hundreds of officers. They had to investigate and clear anyone serving in senior positions who worked west of Hawaii for the better part of a decade. They had to rule them out from membership in the wolf pack and deem them an uncool kid. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestion and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we take a joyride around Okinawa. Until then, take care. Conduct and Becoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct and Becoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.